What are effective ways to engage people in climate change discussions and/or action?
No, there's no one answer to that. It's in some ways it's very audience specific, and I would say that I don't tailor my talks heavily to different audiences. I tailor them somewhat, usually more in terms of time limitations as opposed to content. So, what works, I would say, depends on both who's giving the talk and the audience. Since I'm giving the talk and I'm billed and presented to the audience as a physicist, as a scientist, I have a certain license to speak in those terms. There are many communicators of this material who are not scientists and who speak in different terms. And actually, I spend a lot of time working with those communicators. And the name of the game here, maybe to better answer your question, the name of the game is storytelling. You want to tell stories that people can connect to, not just intellectually and say, okay, I understand that pumping carbon into the atmosphere warms the planet for the following physics reasons. And I can explain that or make it plausible pretty easily. But it doesn't explain to me why it's important to me, right? And so the storytelling is very important. We also have this problem, as we talked about earlier, which is the topic is politicized. What that means, when anything's politicized, what that means is people, some people, in this case many people, tend to take their opinions on that topic based not on the information that they have sort of rationally sorted through and thought about, but based on what they think they're supposed to believe as a member of a particular group. You know, it's pretty frustrating when you're talking about just basic science. So it's like saying, you know, if I were to make the statement, Einstein's special theory of relativity, one consequence of that is that turns out we can't travel faster than the speed of light. Now, I might make that statement to a group and we could take a poll and say how many people agree with that and how many people disagree with that. And some are going to agree, some are going to disagree. You would not expect those who agree or disagree to be correlated with political affiliation. You'd expect some Republicans will disagree, some Democrats will disagree. You know, it's just going to be random. It's not correlated. But that's not the case with some topics we know. With climate change, it is highly correlated. And it's as ridiculous as saying 2 + 2 = 4. Do you believe that or not believe it? And the people who believe it are correlated with one political persuasion, and the people who don't are correlated with another. So clearly this is a much more complicated communication problem. And where I've landed is we are at a state in our society now for a number of reasons, but the long and short of it is a huge portion of our population has been propagandized so intensely, not just on climate, but on a tribalistic political mindset, that there is no penetrating it. And so I disengage with those audiences. There are some people who continue to engage with those audiences. I'm not the right messenger for those audiences. There are good messengers for those audiences, but they tend to come from those communities. So what I tend to spend my time on is audiences that are, you know, kind of get that we have these problems. And what I try to do is help them understand the real scale of them and the real urgency of them. Because in my mind, that's where most of the gain is to be had, is not trying to move the immovable, but trying to get those who are movable to understand the scale of the urgency and the scale of the challenge and the scale of the opportunity and motivate them to start acting. That's where I think my efforts can best be served. That's not to say that there aren't other storytellers out there who are trying to work on those different communities. If you want to work in this field, I would say, you know, there's a whole ecosystem of storytelling and messaging to be done. And so I don't criticize those who are working with those other audiences that I don't work with. I'm happy they're doing that. We need to be doing a whole spectrum of it.
What is the most important piece of advice you can offer students wishing to engage in climate action?
Two things. The first thing is because this topic is so politicized, it is often uncomfortable for people to talk about. It's avoided. And if you actually are interested in working on this topic, you just got to get over that. We have to talk about it. We have to find ways to engage with our families, with our peers, with our colleagues, with our faith groups, whatever group you're in, talking about it, and using your voice as a respected member of some community, whatever community that is. We have to have these difficult conversations. We're not going to get anywhere unless we talk about this. Number one, you can't avoid it. And number two, working on climate, because climate, as I mentioned before, is one piece of a much broader pathology. One piece of a much larger impact of humans on our life support system, our environment. And because this is arising from human systems that we have created, just about anything you're interested in working on in terms of public improvement, whether you're interested in working on healthcare, on education, on any kind of social justice issue, whether you're interested in finance or politics or law or architecture or farming, or you want to be a chef, you name it. There is a place in working on climate change for all of that. Part of it is understanding the connections of those things to climate change. So you need to educate yourself how you want to be a chef. How is food related to climate change? For example. And you can substitute any possible discipline into that sentence I just gave you. And I'll give you an example. You want to be a violinist in a string quartet? How can I work on climate change? Well, you can work on it by helping to tell the story, for example. So my advice for someone who wants to work on this is to put your interests and talents and resources to work. You don't have to, change from being a violin performance major to being an environmental science major. Go with your strengths and educate yourself as to how those strengths can be applied to this problem. And it's not hard to do that. It's not hard to educate yourself on that. We've got these tools these days that help us do that. So I would say, because addressing these problems, and climate change in particular in this case, involves systemic change throughout our entire society. We have to transform systems. You have to figure out how your interests are related to those systems. And then from within your professional work, not just your personal life of changing light bulbs and buying an electric car, that's all good and that's all necessary. But what we really need is systemic change, and that has to come from our broader lives, not just our personal lives. And so figure out how to do that and do it.
Hi, my name is Silas, and this is my climate leadership story. Growing up, I was raised with the fundamental love of nature. Family time in the woods is the closest thing to religion I've ever had. Like many people, I spent a lot of my life knowing and hearing that climate change and global warming were a problem, but it had never been shown how that impacted me and the people around me. My first exposure to the real scale of the problem was when I saw Rob Davies' talk last February. The title of climate physicist caught my attention as a physics major, and sometime afterward I decided that climate change is something that I want to impact. The idea that I won't be able to show my future kids the same world that I grew up in is terrifying, and I want to fight it. So far I've started pretty small, avoiding single-use plastics where I can, using cardboard boxes for my groceries, and thinking a little bit more about where my food comes from when I can afford it. There's a lot for me to go, and this class is opening my eyes further to how people can make an impact.